The bullet tears through silk and flesh before T'Chaka can turn his head. There is no warning. There is never any warning when the world decides to end. One moment, the throne room of the Great Mound hums with the soft conversation of diplomats and tribal elders, the air sweet with ceremonial incense, the walls shimmering with veins of raw vibranium catching the afternoon light. The next moment, there is only thunder. Not the thunder of storms, the thunder of automatic weapons. Glass shatters inward from the great windows overlooking Bir Ninzana, those magnificent panels etched with the histories of 1,000 kings, and the bodies of the border tribe guards stationed at the perimeter hit the floor before anyone can scream. Mercenaries pour through the breach. Outsiders. Their faces are pale, their weapons foreign, their eyes hungry with a greed that has no bottom. T'Chaka, king of Wakanda, lord of the Panther tribe, guardian of the mound, rises from his throne with the speed of a man half his age. His ceremonial robes billow behind him like wings. His hand reaches for the short spear mounted beside his seat. The same spear his father carried, and his father before him, all the way back to Bashenga himself. His fingers close around the haft just as a sound unlike anything he has ever heard splits the air. A scream made of pure frequency. A weapon that weaponizes sound itself. The sonic blast catches T'Chaka in the chest and throws him backward. His spine strikes the throne with a crack that echoes through the chamber. For a moment, just a moment, the king hangs there, suspended between dignity and death, his eyes wide with a shock that transcends pain. He has faced assassins before. He has survived poisonings, ambushes, betrayals from those he called brother. But this is something else. This is annihilation wrapped in noise. And at the centre of the carnage, walking calmly through the shattered window with a device mounted on his arm that glows with stolen vibranium energy, is a white man with a smile that belongs in nightmares. Ulysses Klaue. "Your Majesty," Klaue says, and the words drip with mockery. "I've come to collect what your ancestors stole from the earth." T'Chaka tries to rise. His legs refuse him. Blood pools beneath his robes, so much blood spreading across the ancient stones like a tide that cannot be stopped. He can feel his heartbeat slowing, can feel the cold creeping up from his extremities toward his centre. He is dying. He knows it with the certainty of a man who has presided over the deaths of warriors and wondered always what it would feel like when his own moment came. But it is not his own death that breaks him. It is the small figure frozen in the doorway to the western corridor. A boy, 12 years old, dressed in the ceremonial garb of a prince, his face twisted into an expression of horror so pure it will haunt everyone who survives this day. T'Challa, his son, his heir, his everything. "Run," T'Chaka whispers. The word barely leaves his lips. His throat is filling with fluid. His vision is narrowing to a tunnel. "Run, my son, run, and do not look back." But T'Challa does not run. The boy stands rooted to the spot as the mercenaries fan out through the throne room as Klaue's men begin loading vibranium ore into containers with brutal efficiency, as the screams of dying guards echo from the corridors beyond. His small hands are clenched into fists at his sides. His eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes that have always seen more than a child should, are fixed on his father's crumpled form. "Papa," T'Challa breathes. Klaue notices the boy. His smile widens. "Ah, the little prince. You know, I met your grandfather once. Well, I met his corpse. My father showed it to me, told me stories about the savages who hoarded the greatest treasure on Earth while the rest of humanity starved for progress." He raises the sonic weapon, aims it at T'Challa with casual cruelty. "Perhaps I'll tell my own children about you someday." What happens next will be debated by historians, analysed by military strategists, and whispered about in the halls of Wakandan power for generations to come. The prince moves. He moves faster than any 12-year-old should be capable of moving. He moves with a fluidity that speaks of training begun before he could walk, of muscles conditioned for combat from the moment they could hold weight. He ducks beneath the sonic blast, the scream of it passing so close to his ear that it will ring for days afterward, and launches himself at Klaue with nothing but his bare hands and a rage that burns hotter than any weapon. They collide. It is not a fair fight. It was never going to be a fair fight. Klaue is a grown man, a killer, augmented by technology, and driven by decades of obsession. T'Challa is a child. But the child fights with something Claw cannot understand, something that transcends size and strength and experience. He fights with the fury of a son watching his father die. T'Challa's fingers find the mechanism of Claw's weapon. He does not know how it works, not yet that knowledge will come later, in the sleepless nights of study and obsession. But he knows where the power source connects to the firing chamber. He wrenches, he tears, and when the device overloads, when the sonic energy backfires in a shriek of mechanical failure, it is Claw who screams, the arm, the weapon. They cease to exist in any recognizable form. Claw staggers backward, clutching the cauterized stump where his right hand used to be, his face contorted with a pain that borders on ecstasy. "You!" he gasps, staring at the boy with something that might be hatred, might be admiration, might be the dawning recognition that he has created something far more dangerous than he intended. "You little—" But his mercenaries are already retreating. The Dora Milaje have arrived, those crimson-clad warrior women who guard the throne with their lives, and they are cutting through Claw's forces like scythes through wheat. The mission is failing. The element of surprise is gone, and Claw, for all his madness, knows when to flee. He runs. He takes what vibranium his men managed to load. He takes his ruined arm and his shattered pride. He leaves behind a throne room soaked in blood and a kingdom that will never be the same. T'Challa does not pursue him. The boy walks, slowly now, across the carnage-strewn floor to where his father lies. T'Chaka's eyes are still open. His breath comes in shallow, rattling gasps. His hand, the same hand that once lifted T'Challa onto his shoulders to see the sunset over the Golden City. The same hand that guided the boy's grip on his first training spear, the same hand that rested on his son's head during the blessing ceremonies, reaches upward, trembling, searching. T'Challa takes it. Father and son look at each other. There are no words. Words have become meaningless in the face of what is happening. The world has narrowed to this single point of contact. Two hands clasped together, one growing cold, one burning with the heat of grief that will never fully cool. "You will be greater than I ever was," T'Chaka whispers. Each word costs him something vital. Each syllable is a gift purchased with the last of his strength. "Promise me, T'Challa. Promise me you will protect them, our people, our home. Promise me you will be the king Wakanda deserves." "I promise," T'Challa says. His voice does not waver. His grip does not loosen. And when T'Chaka's eyes slide closed, when the breath leaves his lungs for the final time, when the king becomes another ancestor in the long line of those who came before, T'Challa does not cry. Not yet. He will cry later, in the privacy of his chambers, where no one can see the prince shatter and reform into something harder. He will cry into his pillow until his throat is raw, until his eyes burn, until there is nothing left inside him but the cold, crystalline purpose of vengeance. But now, in this moment, surrounded by death and the distant wails of a nation learning that its king has fallen, T'Challa simply holds his father's hand and makes a silent vow to the Panther god watching from above. He will become something that cannot be broken. He will hunt Ulysses' Claw to the ends of the earth. He will make Wakanda untouchable, and he will never ever let anyone he loves die in front of him again. The Dora Milaje find him there an hour later, still kneeling, still holding his father's hand. When they try to lead him away, he does not resist. He rises with the poise of a boy who has already begun the transformation into a king. He walks through the ruined throne room with his chin raised, his eyes dry, his heart a furnace. Behind him, the sun sets over Berninzana, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. A kingdom mourns, a prince hardens, and somewhere, in a stolen aircraft fleeing across the Atlantic, Ulysses' Claw clutches his ruined arm and laughs, because he does not yet understand what he has awakened. He does not know that the boy he left behind in that throne room will become the most dangerous predator on the planet. He does not know that he has just made an enemy of the Black Panther. But to understand how T'Challa would claim that sacred mantle, to understand why it mattered, what it meant, and why Wakanda was worth fighting for in the first place, we must go back, far, far back, to a time before kings and princes, before the Golden City rose from the jungle, before the 5 tribes carved out their territories and swore their ancient oaths. We must go back to the moment a star fell from the heavens and changed everything. 10,000 centuries before T'Challa drew his first breath, the African continent slumbered beneath a sky unmarked by satellites or aircraft, untouched by the light pollution of cities that would not exist for millennia. The jungle canopy stretched unbroken from horizon to horizon, a sea of green so vast and so ancient that the trees themselves remembered a time before mammals walked upright. Creatures that would leave no fossil record prowled through the undergrowth. Rivers carved their paths through bedrock with the patient determination of deep time. And above it all, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to the world below. Until one of them fell. The meteorite entered Earth's atmosphere at an angle that would later be calculated by Wakandan scientists as mathematically improbable. A trajectory so precise that some would argue it could not have been coincidence. It screamed across the heavens, trailing fire, a wound torn in the fabric of the night, and for 100 miles in every direction, every living thing looked up. Predators paused mid-hunt. Prey animals froze in their grazing. Even the insects fell silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The impact, when it came, reshaped geography. A crater 3 miles wide tore itself into existence. The shockwave flattened trees for 50 miles in every direction, creating a perfect circle of devastation that would take centuries to heal. Earthquakes rippled outward through the continental plate. Tsunamis crashed against distant shores. A column of dust and debris rose into the upper atmosphere and lingered there for months, dimming the sun and cooling the climate in ways that would puzzle paleontologists studying this era in the distant future. But the true transformation was not visible from above. The meteorite, and it was not merely a meteorite, not merely a chunk of space rock following the mindless laws of physics, had burrowed deep into the earth. It had come to rest a mile beneath the surface, nestled in a pocket of volcanic activity that would keep it warm, would keep it active, would allow it to bleed its essence into the surrounding soil and stone and water. Vibranium. The word would not exist for thousands of years. The element had no name in any human language because no human had ever encountered it, had ever suspected that such a thing could exist. It was alien in the truest sense, not of this world, not bound by the rules that governed earthly matter. It absorbed kinetic energy. It resonated at frequencies that could shatter mountains or heal wounds. It was stronger than any metal known to science, yet lighter than aluminum. And it was alive, in some sense, that defied easy categorization, pulsing with an energy that was neither heat nor electricity nor radiation, but something else entirely. Something divine. The vibranium seeped into the land. It infused the water table, creating springs and streams that sparkled with an iridescence that had no natural explanation. It saturated the soil, and in that soil plants began to grow that existed nowhere else on Earth. Flora with leaves that changed colour based on the emotions of those who touched them, flowers that bloomed in mathematical patterns too perfect to be random, trees whose roots burrowed down and down until they touched the meteorite itself and drew power from its inexhaustible heart. And in the centre of this transformed land, a single plant emerged that would change the course of human history, the heart-shaped herb. It grew in a small clearing at the exact point where the meteor's energy concentrated most intensely. Its leaves were the purple of twilight, its stem the silver of starlight, and its roots went deeper than any botanist would ever measure. To consume it raw was death. The concentrated vibranium energies would stop a human heart in seconds, but prepared correctly, brewed into a sacred compound that only the shamans of later ages would learn to create, it granted power beyond mortal comprehension. Enhanced strength, superhuman speed, senses sharpened to the point where one could hear a heartbeat from 100 yards away, could smell fear on the wind, could see in darkness as clearly as daylight. The herb did not merely improve the human form, it perfected it. It took the raw clay of mortality and sculpted it into something approaching godhood. But that knowledge lay far in the future. For now, the impact zone smouldered. The crater filled with water, becoming a lake that glowed faintly in the darkness. The animals that had survived the initial devastation began, cautiously, to return, and those that drank from the vibranium-laced waters, those that ate the mutated plants and breathed the charged air, began to change. Panthers grew larger, stronger, more intelligent than their cousins in other lands. Gorillas developed an almost human cunning. Birds sang in frequencies that seemed to carry meaning. The Great Mound, as it would come to be called, became a place of power, a nexus, a wound in the world through which something otherworldly continued to bleed. And eventually, inevitably, humans found it. They came in small groups at first, nomadic tribes following game trails that led, as if by instinct, toward the crater. They saw the strange lights playing above the lake at night. They tasted the water and felt strength surge through their limbs. They ate the fruits of the impossible trees and dreamed dreams of such vivid intensity that they woke speaking in tongues they had never learned. Some fled, terrified of what they could not understand. They became the ancestors of peoples who would settle far from this cursed ground, carrying stories of a demon-haunted jungle where the earth itself was possessed by spirits. But others stayed. They built their first settlements on the edges of the crater. They learned through generations of trial and error, through deaths that were mourned and lessons that were carved into oral tradition, which plants were safe to eat and which brought madness, which waters healed and which poisoned, which paths through the jungle led to game and which led to predators that no longer feared human hunters. They became the first Wakandans, though they did not yet call themselves by that name. 5 tribes emerged from those early settlers, each claiming a different territory within the Vibranium-blessed land. The Panther tribe settled closest to the meteor itself, drawn to the heart-shaped herbs clearing as if by magnetic force. The Border tribe ranged along the edges of the transformed zone, where the jungle met the normal world, and they became the first line of defense against outsiders who might covet what the meteor had given. The River tribe followed the glowing waterways, becoming fishermen and traders and keepers of the liquid paths. The mining tribe delved into the earth itself, learning to extract the precious metal that lay beneath the soil. And the merchant tribe built the first markets, the first systems of exchange, the first economic infrastructure of what would become the wealthiest nation on earth. A 6th tribe, the Jabari, retreated to the mountains at the edge of the territory. They watched the others embrace the meteor's gifts with suspicion and disdain. They worshipped not the panther but the gorilla, and they swore ancient oaths to reject the vibranium that they saw as corruption rather than blessing. Their isolation would last for millennia. But it was the Panther tribe that produced the first king. His name was Bashenga, and the stories of his deeds have been passed down through 10,000 years of oral tradition, each generation adding new details, new miracles, new proof of his divine right to rule. What is known with certainty is this: Bashenga was a warrior without equal. He had led his people in the endless skirmishes between tribes, had defended the heart-shaped herbs clearing against those who would claim its power for themselves, had killed with spear and knife and bare hands when necessary. And one night, as he stood vigil over the sacred grove, Bast came to him, the Panther god. The divine protector who had watched over the land since before the meteor fell. Some said Bast had been drawn to this place by the vibranium's energy, a deity attracted to power like a flame attracts moths. Others said Bast had guided the meteor here deliberately, had chosen this land and these people for a purpose that mortal minds could not comprehend. The truth, as with all matters of faith, remained beyond proof. What mattered was the vision. Bashenga saw a panther the size of a mountain, its fur made of the night sky itself, its eyes burning with the light of dying stars. It spoke to him without words, in a language that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his soul. It told him of a sacred duty. It told him of a mantle that would pass from generation to generation, a protector chosen by the divine to guard this land and its people. It told him to consume the heart-shaped herb, not raw, as others had tried and died, but prepared according to methods that Bast implanted directly into his memory. Bashenga obeyed. The transformation was agony and ecstasy intertwined. His muscles tore and rebuilt themselves stronger. His bones hardened to the density of the meteor metal. His senses exploded outward until he could hear conversations happening miles away, could smell the individual scents of every tribesman in the surrounding camps, could see the heat signatures of animals hiding in the deepest shadows. He was no longer merely human. He was the first Black Panther. Bashenga united the 5 tribes not through conquest but through demonstration. He showed them what the Panther god's blessing could achieve. He defended them against external threats, the warlords and raiders who had begun to notice that something extraordinary was happening in this remote corner of the continent. He established the first laws, the first rituals, the first systems of succession that would govern Wakanda for millennia to come, and he made a decision that would define his nation's relationship with the outside world for all the ages that followed. Wakanda would hide. The vibranium was too precious, too powerful, too dangerous to be shared with a world that was not ready for it. Bashenga had seen what greed did to men, had watched tribes tear themselves apart over far lesser treasures. He could not imagine what the nations beyond the jungle would do if they learned of a metal that could reshape the very foundations of civilization. So the first king decreed that Wakanda would be invisible, its borders would be sealed, its existence would be denied. Any outsider who stumbled upon the truth would be dealt with, sometimes through mercy, sometimes through methods that later generations would prefer not to discuss. The meteor had fallen from the heavens like a gift from the gods. Wakanda would keep that gift for itself. Bashenga ruled for 40 years before passing the mantle to his son. His son ruled and passed it to his daughter. Generation after generation, the line of panthers continued unbroken, each one consuming the heart-shaped herb, each one receiving the blessing of Bast, each one adding to the growing legend of a kingdom that the outside world would never know existed. The Golden City rose from the jungle. Technology advanced at a pace that outstripped the rest of humanity by centuries, then millennia. The vibranium was refined, studied, integrated into every aspect of Wakandan life, until the border between science and magic became impossible to distinguish. And through it all, the Black Panther watched over them, a guardian chosen by God, a king forged by alien fire, a legacy that would one day fall upon the shoulders of a boy kneeling in his father's blood, swearing vengeance against a world that had dared to violate his home. But that boy's story was still millennia away. For now, Wakanda grew in secret, hidden behind walls of jungle and deception, nursing its treasures and its traditions in the darkness where no outsider could see. Until eventually, inevitably, someone began to suspect the truth. To the satellites that passed overhead in the modern age, Wakanda appeared as nothing more than a stretch of unremarkable African wilderness. Dense jungle canopy broken by occasional clearings, a small lake that glinted in the sunlight, perhaps a few primitive villages, the kind that development agencies might target for charitable intervention, thatched roofs, dirt roads, subsistence farming. The spy planes of a dozen nations had photographed this territory. The intelligence analysts of a dozen more had studied those photographs and concluded, with confident dismissiveness, that there was nothing here worth investigating. They could not have been more wrong. Beneath that canopy of carefully cultivated trees, hidden by holographic projectors so sophisticated they could fool the most advanced imaging technology on Earth, lay a civilization that made the rest of the world look like children playing with sticks and stones. The Golden City, Berninzana in the Wakandan tongue, sprawled across the valley, floor in a symphony of impossible architecture. Towers of gleaming vibranium alloy rose hundreds of feet into the air, their surfaces rippling with energy fields that regulated temperature, repelled debris, and converted sunlight into power with an efficiency that human scientists would not achieve for another 2 centuries. Magnetic levitation trains glided silently between districts, carrying citizens from the residential spires to the commercial centres to the sacred grounds of the palace with speeds that would have shamed any bullet train in Japan or Europe. And everywhere, the vibranium. It was woven into the fabric of daily life so thoroughly that most Wakandans no longer noticed it. The streets themselves were paved with a vibranium composite that absorbed the impact of footsteps, making walking feel like gliding across clouds. The buildings incorporated vibranium lattices that rendered them virtually indestructible, earthquakes that would have flattened cities. Elsewhere passed through Berninzana as gentle tremors, absorbed and dispersed by the metal's unique properties. Communication devices used vibranium-based quantum entanglement to transmit data instantaneously across any distance. Medical technology employed vibranium nanoparticles that could repair cellular damage, fight infection, and extend the average Wakandan lifespan by decades. This was not merely a city, it was a temple to human potential, built by a people who had never been conquered, never been colonized, never been forced to rebuild from the ashes of someone else's war. But Berninzana was only the heart of a nation far larger and more complex than any outsider could imagine. The 5 tribes that had formed in the shadow of the meteor still existed, each maintaining their distinct identity even as they contributed to the greater whole. The Panther tribe held the throne, of course. The royal line of Bashenga had never been broken, and the Black Panther who wore the mantle was always, without exception, a child of that bloodline. They occupied the palace complex at the centre of the Golden City, a structure that blended ancient architectural traditions with technology so advanced it seemed indistinguishable from sorcery. Within those walls the king held court, the Council of Elders debated policy, and the sacred rituals that connected each new panther to Bast were performed in chambers that had not changed in 10,000 years. The border tribe ringed the nation's edges, just as they had since the days of Bashenga. Their territory was the most deceptive. To outside eyes, it appeared to be nothing more than pastoral farmland, dotted with cattle and simple homesteads. The farmers who tended those fields wore rough-spun clothing and carried wooden staffs and spoke in dialects calculated to sound primitive to any foreign ear. But beneath those humble garments, each border tribesman carried weapons capable of levelling a battalion. Their cattle were, monitored by implanted sensors that tracked every movement within 50 miles of the perimeter. Their wooden staffs concealed vibranium cores that could generate force fields or discharge energy blasts with a touch. They were the first line of defence, and they took their duty with a seriousness that bordered on religious devotion. The river tribe followed the waterways that laced through Wakandan territory. Their villages built on platforms that floated above the glowing currents. They were traders and diplomats, the tribe most likely to interact with the rare outsider who was granted limited access to the kingdom. Their specialty was information. They maintained the vast databases that stored Wakanda's accumulated knowledge, and they trained the spies who occasionally ventured beyond the borders to monitor developments in the outside world. When the king needed to know what the Americans were building in their weapons laboratories or what the Russians were planning in their political chambers, it was the river tribe who provided the intelligence. The mining tribe lived closest to the Great Mound itself, in vast underground complexes that descended miles beneath the surface. They were engineers and metallurgists, the keepers of the vibranium extraction processes that had been refined over countless generations. Every gram of the precious metal that entered Wakandan industry passed through their hands. They knew its properties more intimately than anyone else alive, knew which refinement techniques produced the strongest alloys, which frequencies made the metal sing, which treatments could unlock capabilities that remained theoretical, even to the brilliant scientists of the palace laboratories. They were not warriors by tradition, but their knowledge made them perhaps the most strategically vital tribe in the kingdom. The merchant tribe handled commerce, both internal and the carefully controlled external trade that kept Wakanda's illusion of poverty believable. They exported just enough vibranium, in tiny quantities, through untraceable channels to buyers who never learned where it came from, to fund the foreign currency accounts that allowed Wakandan agents to operate abroad. They managed the economic systems that ensured every citizen had access to food, shelter, healthcare, and education. They were bankers and accountants, logistics experts and supply chain managers, and without their invisible labour, the entire apparatus of Wakandan civilization would have ground to a halt. And then there were the Jabari. The mountain tribe had never truly reconciled with the others. They lived in the frozen peaks that marked Wakanda's northern border, in fortresses carved from living rock by generations of labourers who rejected the easy shortcuts that vibranium technology would have provided. They worshipped Hanuman, the gorilla god, and they viewed the Panther tribe's reliance on the heart-shaped herb as a corruption of human potential. True strength, they believed, came from discipline and suffering, not from alien metals and divine shortcuts. The Jabari had refused to participate in the united government for thousands of years. They sent no representatives to the council. They accepted no vibranium technology. They intermarried only among themselves, maintaining a genetic and cultural isolation that had made them almost a separate people. Their warriors were formidable, trained from childhood in brutal combat techniques, hardened by the unforgiving mountain climate, and motivated by a fierce pride that bordered on arrogance. When they descended from the peaks, which was rare, it was usually to challenge some aspect of Panther tribe authority. They were not enemies exactly, but they were not friends either. They were a reminder that Wakanda's unity was more fragile than it appeared, that beneath the surface of technological marvel and political stability lay ancient tensions that had never been fully resolved. The glue that held everything together, the institution that transcended tribal loyalty and commanded universal respect, was the Dora Milaje. They were the king's personal guard, but that simple description did them a profound disservice. The Dora Milaje were selected from every tribe, including occasional Jabari candidates who chose service to the throne over loyalty to the mountains. They trained from childhood in combat techniques that incorporated the best of Wakandan martial tradition, with the enhanced capabilities that vibranium weapons provided. They were artists of violence, capable of defeating opponents 5 times their number through a combination of skill, technology, and an absolute willingness to die for their king. But they were more than bodyguards. In ancient times, the Dora Milaje had served as potential wives for the king, a tradition designed to ensure that no single tribe could dominate the royal bloodline through marriage politics. That aspect of their role had faded in modern times, but the symbolic significance remained. The Dora Milaje represented the unity of Wakanda itself, a living embodiment of the principle that all tribes served the Panther throne. Their leader held the title of General, currently Okoye, a woman whose skill with a vibranium spear was matched only by her uncompromising loyalty and her complete lack of patience for fools. She had served 3 kings, had watched T'Chaka rise and fall, and T'Challa claim his birthright. She would die before allowing harm to come to the throne, and everyone who knew her understood that this was not metaphor but simple statement of fact. Beyond the living city and the tribal territories lay one more sacred space, the necropolis, the city of the dead. Here, in vast catacombs beneath the palace, rested the remains of every Black Panther who had ever lived. Their bodies had been preserved through techniques that combined ancient embalming with vibranium-based stasis technology, and there, spirits lingered in a realm between life and death called the ancestral plane. When a new panther consumed the heart-shaped herb, they could visit this plane, could speak with their predecessors, could draw upon millennia of accumulated wisdom. The dead were not gone in Wakanda. They were advisors, waiting to be consulted. This was the kingdom that the outside world did not know existed. This was the civilization that had watched humanity stumble through its dark ages and its world wars, its industrial revolutions and its nuclear nightmares, without ever lifting a finger to intervene. The debate over whether that isolation was wisdom or cowardice had raged in the council chambers for generations. Some argued that Wakanda had a responsibility to share its gifts, that hoarding vibranium technology while billions suffered in poverty was a moral crime of the highest order. Others countered that revealing themselves would invite invasion, exploitation, the same fate that had befallen every other African nation when Europeans arrived with their guns and their diseases and their insatiable hunger for resources. The kings of Wakanda had always chosen isolation, but cracks were forming in that consensus. The world was changing. Threats were emerging that did not respect borders or secrets, and a young prince who had seen the outside world with his own eyes was beginning to question whether his ancestors had made the right choice. The hidden kingdom could not hide forever. Eventually, the world would find them, or they would have to find the world. The birth of T'Challa was heralded by omens that the shamans of the Panther tribe would debate for decades afterward. On the night Queen Nyami went into labour, the sky above Berninzana blazed with lights that had no scientific explanation, aurora-like curtains of purple and gold that danced above the palace spires, visible even through the holographic camouflage that hid the city from the outside world. The heart-shaped herb, garden, which normally bloomed only during the wet season, erupted into sudden flower. And in the necropolis below, the preserved bodies of a dozen former panthers were reported to have stirred in their stasis chambers, as if the ancestors themselves were straining to witness what was about to occur. T'Chaka paced the corridors outside the birthing chamber, his ceremonial robes abandoned for simple training clothes, his usual composure shattered by the primal terror of a husband who could do nothing but wait. He was the Black Panther, the most dangerous man in Wakanda, capable of feats that would have seemed miraculous to the world beyond the borders, but in this moment, he was powerless. The shamans had barred him from the room, citing ancient tradition, and even a king did not overrule the shamans in matters of birth and death. The screams from within went on for hours, then, abruptly, they stopped. When the doors finally opened, the head shaman emerged with an expression that T'Chaka could not read. In her arms, wrapped in cloth woven from vibranium-threaded silk, was a baby boy, small and perfect, his eyes already open, already watching the world with an intensity that made the shaman shiver. "Your son, my king," she said. "He is strong. He is healthy. The ancestors have blessed him. T'Chaka reached for the child, and as his fingers touched the infant's skin, he felt something pass between them, a current of recognition, of destiny, of the unbroken chain that connected every Black Panther to those who came before. His son, his heir, the future of Wakanda, cradled in his arms. "And Niami?" he asked, though some part of him already knew the answer. The shaman's silence was confirmation enough. The queen had hemorrhaged in the final moments of delivery. The palace physicians, for all their advanced technology, had not been able to save her. She had lived just long enough to hold her son once, to whisper his name, T'Challa, which meant he who put himself on the line for his people in the ancient tongue, before her eyes closed for the last time. T'Chaka stood in the corridor for a long moment, his newborn son in his arms, his dead wife beyond the door, and felt the weight of kingship pressing down on him like a physical force. He had taken lives in battle. He had ordered executions when justice demanded them. He had made decisions that shaped the fate of millions. But this grief was different. This was personal in a way that kingship rarely allowed. The boy in his arms began to cry, not the wailing of a hungry infant, but something softer, almost questioning, as if he sensed the sorrow that hung in the air. "Hush, little one," T'Chaka murmured, pulling his son closer. "I will teach you everything. I will prepare you for the mantle that awaits, and when you are ready, you will be greater than I ever was. This I swear on your mother's memory." It was a promise he would keep. T'Challa's childhood was unlike anything experienced by children in the outside world, even the children of kings and presidents and billionaires. From the moment he could walk, he was enrolled in a curriculum designed to produce the perfect ruler, a program refined over thousands of years, tested on hundreds of heirs, and adjusted constantly based on the specific needs of each generation. He learned to read at the age of 3, not merely in Wakandan, but in 12 other languages that the Council deemed strategically important: English, Mandarin, Arabic, Russian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Swahili, Hindi, Japanese, German and ancient Greek, the tongue in which many foundational texts of Western philosophy had been written. By the age of 5, he was conversing fluently in all of them, correcting his tutor's grammar with a precision that was either impressive or insufferable, depending on whom you asked. Mathematics came next, then physics, then chemistry, then biology. The royal tutors quickly discovered that T'Challa did not merely learn subjects. He devoured them. He asked questions that his teachers could not answer, then disappeared into the palace archives to find the answers himself. He conducted experiments in his chambers that occasionally resulted in small explosions, much to the alarm of his caretakers. By the age of 10, he had independently derived principles of quantum mechanics that Wakandan scientists had taken generations to develop. "The boy is not merely intelligent," the head tutor reported to T'Chaka during one of their regular briefings. "He is unprecedented. His mind works in ways I cannot fully comprehend. He sees patterns where others see chaos. He makes intuitive leaps that should require decades of study." T'Chaka nodded, unsurprised. He had seen the same qualities in himself at that age, and in his father before him. The heart-shaped herb enhanced more than physical capabilities. It optimized neural pathways, sharpened cognitive function, passed genetic improvements from one generation to the next. Each Black Panther was slightly more capable than the last. T'Challa was simply the latest iteration of a breeding program that had been running for 10,000 years. But intelligence without physical prowess was incomplete. A king had to be able to defend his people with his own body, not merely his mind. So T'Challa trained. The Dora Milaje served as his primary combat instructors, a decision that raised eyebrows among the traditionalists who believed a prince should learn from male warriors. T'Chaka overruled them without hesitation. The Dora Milaje were the finest fighters in Wakanda. If his son was to become the finest fighter in Wakanda, he would learn from the best. They were not gentle with him. By the age of 8, T'Challa had broken his nose twice, his collarbone once, and accumulated a collection of scars that mapped his body like a chronicle of lessons learned. The Dora Milaje fought him at full speed with real weapons because enemies would not slow down for a prince. They taught him the panther forms, the ancient martial arts that had been developed specifically to complement the heart-shaped herb's enhancements, low stances that exploited enhanced leg strength, rapid strikes that took advantage of superhuman reflexes, defensive techniques that used vibranium weave armor to absorb incoming force and redirect it back at attackers. They also taught him strategy. Warfare was not merely a matter of individual combat. It was logistics, intelligence, psychology, terrain. T'Challa studied the great battles of Wakandan history, analysed the tactics of every Black Panther who had ever led armies, and engaged in simulated campaigns against AI opponents programmed to be unpredictable. By the age of 12, he was defeating simulations that had been designed for adult generals, but his education was not confined to war and science. T'Chaka insisted that his son understand the spiritual dimensions of kingship. T'Challa spent hours in the necropolis, learning the names and stories of every ancestor whose body rested in those sacred chambers. He participated in rituals that connected him to Bast, though he could not yet consume the heart-shaped herb. That privilege was reserved for the moment of true ascension. He meditated in the clearing where Bashenga had first received the Panther God's blessing, feeling the vibranium energy pulse beneath the soil like a second heartbeat. And then there was Shuri. T'Chaka's second wife, Ramonda, had given him a daughter 4 years after T'Challa's birth. Ramonda was a South African woman of royal Lesotho descent, one of the few outsiders ever permitted to marry into the Wakandan monarchy. She brought a perspective that balanced T'Chaka's insularity, and she raised Shuri with the same combination of discipline and affection that characterized T'Challa's upbringing. Shuri was, in many ways, T'Challa's opposite. Where he was measured, she was impulsive. Where he approached problems with methodical analysis, she attacked them with creative intuition. Where he honoured tradition, she questioned everything, including traditions that had stood unquestioned for millennia. She was also, infuriatingly, almost as brilliant as he was. Their relationship oscillated between fierce rivalry and deeper affection. They competed in everything: combat training, academic assessments, even games that had no stakes beyond bragging rights. T'Challa won more often, but Shuri's victories were always spectacular, always achieved through methods that no one had anticipated. She had a gift for innovation that even T'Challa had to admire. "You will be king," she told him once, when they were teenagers hiding on a palace balcony, watching the lights of Burnin Zana spread beneath them like a galaxy brought to Earth. "But I will build the weapons you carry. I will design the technology that keeps our people safe. And when historians write about your reign, they will have to mention me in every chapter." T'Challa had laughed, one of the rare moments when the weight of expectation lifted from his shoulders. "Then we will be partners," he said, "the king and the genius. Wakanda will be fortunate to have us both." It was a promise they would keep, though the path there would prove far more painful than either could imagine. At 16, T'Chaka made a decision that shocked the council. He sent T'Challa abroad. The prince enrolled at Oxford under a false identity, posing as the son of a minor African diplomat. He studied physics, excelled beyond all expectations, and walked among outsiders for the first time in his life. He saw their poverty and their wealth, their kindness and their cruelty, their desperate striving and their casual waste. He made friends who did not know they were befriending a prince. He fell in love briefly with a British girl who taught him that hearts work the same way regardless of borders. And he returned to Wakanda changed. He had seen what the world could be with Wakandan technology. He had also seen why Wakanda feared to share it. Both truths lived inside him now, unresolved, waiting for the day when he would have to choose between them. That day came sooner than anyone expected, heralded by gunfire and screaming and the sight of his father bleeding out on the throne room floor. Ulysses Klaue was born to hate Wakanda before he ever knew it existed. His father, Fritz Klauer, had been a physicist in the service of Nazi Germany, a man whose brilliance was matched only by his moral vacancy. During the Second World War, Fritz had stumbled upon references to a mysterious African kingdom in documents seized from a Belgian colonial archive. The documents spoke of a metal unlike any known to science, a substance that could revolutionize weapons technology, that could have turned the tide of the war if only it could be obtained. Fritz became obsessed. He mounted an expedition in 1943 leading a squad of SS soldiers into the heart of the African continent, following clues that had been assembled from decades of fragmented reports, missionaries who had glimpsed impossible cities, explorers who had vanished near a particular stretch of jungle, traders who spoke of natives carrying weapons that seemed to glow with inner fire. The expedition reached the borders of what they did not know was Wakanda. They did not return. The border tribe intercepted them 3 miles from the perimeter. The battle was brief and utterly one-sided. Vibranium spears cut through German steel like paper. Energy weapons dropped soldiers before they could raise their rifles. Fritz Klauer himself was captured, interrogated, and executed, but not before he managed to transmit a single radio message back to his handlers in Berlin. The metal is real. The kingdom is real. They are centuries ahead of us. That message was intercepted by Allied intelligence. It was filed, classified, and forgotten in the chaos of the war's final years. But a copy eventually found its way to a young South African physicist named Ulysses Klaue, Fritz's illegitimate son, raised by a mother who filled his head with stories of his father's genius and his father's murder at the hands of African savages. Ulysses grew up nursing a hatred that bordered on mania. He studied physics with a fervour that impressed and disturbed his professors. He specialised in acoustics, in the weaponization of sound, in technologies that could transform vibration into destruction. And all the while, he searched for the kingdom that had killed his father. He found it. It took 20 years of research, of bribery, of following trails that went cold a dozen times before yielding new leads. He cultivated contacts in intelligence agencies, in mining companies, in archaeological circles. He assembled fragments of evidence that no one else had thought to connect. And finally, in 1992, he stood on a hillside overlooking what appeared to be an unremarkable stretch of jungle and knew with absolute certainty, that the greatest treasure on earth lay hidden beneath those trees. But Klaue was no fool. He understood that a direct assault would be suicide. Wakanda had defeated Nazi soldiers with ease. It would certainly defeat a lone physicist with delusions of conquest. He needed resources. He needed allies. He needed a weapon capable of neutralizing whatever defenses the hidden kingdom possessed. So he built one. The sonic emitter was his masterpiece, a device that converted electrical energy into focused acoustic waves capable of shattering steel, pulverizing stone, and reducing human bodies to paste. He powered it with a sliver of vibranium that he had obtained through channels so dark that even he preferred not to think about them. The metal amplified the device's output 1,000-fold, creating a weapon that could theoretically punch through any defense. He assembled a team of mercenaries, 50 men, hand-picked from the most ruthless private military contractors on 4 continents. He paid them in advance, knowing that most would not survive to collect their bonuses. He briefed them on the target, watching their faces shift from skepticism to greed as he described the wealth that awaited. And on a spring morning in 1992 they struck. The border tribe detected the intrusion within minutes. Their sensors registered the approaching aircraft, unmarked helicopters flying low to avoid radar, carrying enough firepower to conquer a small nation. Warnings flashed across screens in the palace. The Dora Milaje mobilized. T'Chaka himself donned the panther habit, preparing to lead the defense as his ancestors had done for millennia. But Klaue had planned for this. His first wave of helicopters was a distraction, bait designed to draw the defenders toward the northern perimeter, while his real assault team approached from the east. They came on foot, moving through the jungle, with a speed and precision that spoke of months of preparation. They carried the sonic emitter in pieces, assembling it only when they reached the palace walls. The weapon activated with a sound like the world screaming. The palace's vibranium-reinforced walls should have been impenetrable. They had withstood earthquakes, bombs, and the focused attacks of superhumans. But Klaue had calibrated his device to the exact resonant frequency of the metal, a frequency he had derived through years of theoretical work, confirmed by testing on his stolen sample. The walls did not shatter. They vibrated, and in vibrating they created gaps, hairline fractures that lasted only microseconds. But microseconds were enough. The mercenaries poured through. What followed was a massacre, though the question of who was massacring whom remained contested. The Dora Milaje fought with the fury of women defending their home, their king, their entire way of life. They killed mercenaries by the dozen, their vibranium spears singing through the air, their battle cries echoing off the shuddering walls. But the sonic emitter kept firing, kept creating new breaches, kept driving the defenders back toward the throne room. T'Chaka met Klaue in the heart of the palace. The king had already killed 6 mercenaries by the time he reached the central chamber. His habit was slick with blood, none of it his own. His claws had torn through body armor, through flesh, through bone. He was the Black Panther in the fullness of his power, the apex predator of a nation of predators, and he had never felt more alive. Then he saw the white man with the glowing device mounted on his arm. Clower, T'Chaka said. He recognized the face from intelligence briefings, from the files that the River Tribe maintained on potential threats. Your father died here? Did you come to join him? Claw's smile was the smile of a man who had already won. My father died because your ancestors were too cowardly to share what they had stolen from the earth. I came to take it back. They fought. T'Chaka was faster, stronger, more skilled in every measurable dimension of combat, but Claw had not come to fight fairly. The sonic emitter fired, not at T'Chaka directly, but at the ceiling above him. Tons of rubble cascaded down, forcing the king to dodge rather than attack. Another blast targeted the floor, sending vibrations through the vibranium substrate that disrupted T'Chaka's enhanced balance. A third blast caught him in the chest, throwing him backward against his own throne. The king felt his ribs crack, felt something rupture inside him, something that even Wakandan medicine might not be able to repair. Felt the cold certainty of mortality settle into his bones, and in the doorway, watching everything, stood his 12-year-old son. T'Challa had disobeyed orders. He had been commanded to remain in the safe room with Ramonda and Shuri, protected by a squad of Dora Milaje sealed behind doors that could withstand a nuclear blast. But he had slipped away. He had followed the sounds of battle. He had needed to see. Now he saw his father dying and something inside him shattered. What happened next was covered in the cold open of our story. The boy's impossible attack, the destruction of Claw's weapon, the severing of the hand that had held it. But there are details that deserve expansion. T'Challa did not think. Thinking would have paralyzed him. Thinking would have reminded him that he was small and untrained and facing a grown man with alien technology. Instead, he simply moved, guided by instincts that had been honed through years of combat practice, driven by a rage that burned away all fear. He remembered, in that moment, a lesson that Dora Milaje had taught him about pressure points. He remembered a diagram of the sonic emitter that Shuri had shown him when she was analyzing captured vibranium technology. He remembered his father's voice telling him that a true warrior fights not with his muscles but with his mind. His fingers found the junction between the emitter's power source and its firing mechanism. He wrenched. The device overloaded, consuming its own components in a feedback loop that Claw had never anticipated. The explosion took Claw's hand off at the wrist, cauterizing the wound with heat so intense that there was no blood, only the smell of burning flesh, only the sound of a man screaming. Claw fled. His mercenaries fled with him, those few who remained alive. The border tribe was closing in, cutting off escape routes, but Claw had planned for failure as carefully as he had planned for success. A backup aircraft waited beyond the northern perimeter, cloaked by technology he had stolen from sources as dark as Wakanda was bright. He escaped with 17 pounds of raw vibranium and a burning hatred that would consume the rest of his life. Behind him, in the ruined throne room, T'Challa held his father's hand and listened to the king's final words. "You will be greater than I ever was." The words were a blessing and a burden. They were permission to mourn and an order to rise. They were the last gift a father could give his son, the assurance that his death had meaning, that his legacy would continue, that everything he had built would not crumble when his heart stopped beating. T'Chaka's heart stopped beating. T'Challa did not release his hand. He knelt there through the night, refusing food, refusing water, refusing the gentle entreaties of Ramonda and the firm commands of the Dora Milaje. He knelt until dawn broke over Bir Ninzana, until the funeral preparations began, until his grandmother, the Queen Mother, ancient and wise and terrible in her grief, came to him personally and lifted him to his feet. "The dead are dead," she said, in a voice that left no room for argument. "The living must continue. Your father is with Bast now. Your duty is here." T'Challa looked at her with eyes that had aged a decade overnight. "I will kill him," he said. "Claw. I will hunt him to the ends of the earth, and I will kill him." His grandmother did not argue. She did not counsel patience or forgiveness, or the higher path of mercy. She simply nodded, because she understood that some wounds could only be healed by blood. "First," she said, "you must become the Panther. First you must claim the mantle your father wore. First you must prove to the tribes that you are worthy. Then, and only then, may you pursue your vengeance." T'Challa straightened his spine. He released his father's hand, the final letting go, the severance of flesh that death demanded. "Then take me to the trials," he said. "I am ready." He was not ready. No one is ever ready. But readiness was no longer the point. Survival was the point. Vengeance was the point. Becoming something that could never be broken again, that was the point. Warrior Falls thundered with a voice older than memory. The sacred pool churned at the base of the cascade, its waters fed by streams that ran down from the mountains through vibranium-rich soil, giving the spray a faint iridescence that caught the morning light and scattered it into fragments of rainbow. The cliffs surrounding the pool formed a natural amphitheatre, and on every ledge, every outcropping, every platform that had been carved into the stone over millennia, the people of Wakanda gathered to witness the most sacred ritual their civilization possessed: the choosing of a king. T'Challa stood at the water's edge, stripped to the waist, his feet bare against the slick stones. The ceremonial paint on his chest, white and black, the colours of death and rebirth, had been applied by shamans who had prepared 100 kings before him. The marks told the story of Bashenga, of the first Panther, of the covenant between the royal line and the god who had blessed them. They reminded everyone watching that this was not merely politics, this was religion made manifest. He was 19 years old. He had spent the 7 years since his father's death preparing for this moment, training with the Dora Milaje until his body was a weapon, studying with the shamans until his spirit was aligned, mastering every discipline that a king would need to rule. He had hunted Claw across 3 continents, always arriving 1 step behind, always finding cold trails and dead ends, and the mocking evidence of his enemy's escape. That hunt would resume after the coronation, but first this. First, the trial. The rules were ancient and absolute. Any warrior from any tribe could challenge the heir for the right to rule. The combat would continue until one fighter yielded or died. No weapons but those the body provided. No enhancements, even the power of the heart-shaped herb was stripped away through a ritual purification that left the challenger as mortal as any common soldier. T'Challa had never consumed the herb. That privilege came after the trials, not before, but he had trained alongside warriors who had, and he knew what he would face if a challenger stepped forward who had previously held the Panther mantle. He would face superhuman strength, superhuman speed, generations of combat experience encoded in enhanced neural pathways. He would face the possibility of death. Zuri stepped forward to officiate. The old shaman had served T'Chaka for 40 years, had watched T'Challa grow from infant to child to young man, had presided over the funeral rites that sent the fallen king to join his ancestors. His voice carried across the water like a pronouncement from the gods themselves. "I present to you T'Challa, son of T'Chaka, heir to the throne of Wakanda. Is there any among you who would challenge for the mantle of King and Black Panther?" Silence fell over the gathered thousands. The waterfall roared. The wind whispered through the jungle canopy. And for a long moment T'Challa allowed himself to believe that no one would step forward, that the transition would be peaceful, that he could claim his father's legacy without spilling blood. Then the Jabari began their drumming. The sound echoed down from the mountains, a rhythm primal and thunderous, the heartbeat of a tribe that had rejected vibranium but never rejected strength. The crowds parted as warriors descended the cliffside paths, their bodies massive with muscle, their faces painted in the white and grey of the gorilla cult. At their head walked a man who stood nearly 7 feet tall, his chest bare to display scars earned in 100 ritual combats. M'Baku, Lord of the Jabari. He entered the pool with a splash that sent waves crashing against T'Challa's legs. His eyes held contempt that bordered on pity. "The son of T'Chaka," he said, his voice booming across the amphitheatre. "The boy who hid in foreign schools while his father bled. The prince who thinks books and machines make a king." T'Challa said nothing. Words were not weapons in this arena. "The Jabari have rejected your family's rule for 10,000 years, M'Baku continued. "We have watched you embrace the corruption of the meteor while true strength withered. Today, we end the Panther's reign. Today, Wakanda returns to the old ways." He attacked without warning. M'Baku's fist came like a boulder hurled from a catapult. T'Challa slipped sideways, feeling the wind of the blow brush past his cheek, and countered with a strike to the bigger man's ribs. It was like hitting a wall. M'Baku barely flinched. His knee came up, aiming for T'Challa's midsection, and T'Challa twisted away again, dancing on the slick stones, using speed where he could not match strength. The combat lasted 20 minutes. 20 minutes of trading blows in waist-deep water, 20 minutes of blood mixing with spray, of grunts and impacts and the roar of the crowd above. M'Baku's size was an advantage. Every strike that landed threatened to end the fight. But T'Challa had trained against the Dora Milaje, had learned to fight opponents who outmatched him in every physical dimension. He targeted joints, pressure points, the vulnerable spots where even a giant's armor had gaps. The turning point came when M'Baku overextended. He lunged for a grapple, seeking to use his weight to drag T'Challa beneath the surface. T'Challa sidestepped, caught the bigger man's arm, and applied leverage that sent M'Baku crashing face-first into the pool. Before the Jabari Lord could rise, T'Challa was on his back, one arm locked around his throat, squeezing with all the strength his mortal body possessed. "Yield," T'Challa said, his voice calm despite his racing heart. M'Baku thrashed. He tried to rise, to throw his smaller opponent off, but the choke was locked in, blood flow to the brain already interrupted, his movements grew sluggish, his struggles weakened. "Yield and live," T'Challa repeated. "Die here, and the Jabari will have no lord. Your people need you. Yield." For a moment that stretched into eternity, M'Baku continued to fight. Then, with a roar of frustration that echoed off the cliffs, he slapped the water 3 times, the ancient signal of submission. T'Challa released him immediately. M'Baku rose, coughing, water streaming from his face. He stared at the smaller man who had defeated him, and something shifted in his eyes. Not respect, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of it. "This is not over," he said. "The Jabari do not forget." "I would not expect you to," T'Challa replied, "but today you will return to your mountains, and I will take my father's throne." M'Baku spat into the water and turned away. His warriors followed, their drums falling silent, their retreat marked by a dignity that refused to acknowledge defeat. Zuri stepped forward again. "Is there any other who would challenge?" The silence was absolute. "Then T'Challa, son of T'Chaka, has proven his worth through combat. Let him now prove his worth through spirit. Bring forth the heart-shaped herb." The shamans emerged from their concealed positions, carrying a ceremonial vessel carved from a single piece of vibranium ore. Within it lay a flower that glowed with inner light. Purple petals, silver stem, roots that seemed to writhe with their own intelligence. The heart-shaped herb, cultivated in the sacred gardens, prepared according to rituals that had not changed in 10 millennia. T'Challa was led to a shallow grave dug into the riverbank, a symbolic burial, a death before rebirth. He lay down in the cool earth, feeling it embrace him like the arms of the ancestors waiting to receive him. The shamans covered his body with sand, leaving only his face exposed. Then they lifted the vessel to his lips. The herb tasted like nothing he could describe. It was bitter and sweet, hot and cold, present and absent all at once. It slid down his throat and exploded in his stomach, spreading tendrils of fire through his bloodstream. His heart hammered, his vision blurred. The world above him, the faces of the shamans, the spray of the waterfall, the distant cheers of the crowd, dissolved into purple light, and T'Challa died. He opened his eyes in the ancestral plain. The landscape before him was Wakanda, but a Wakanda untouched by time, the savannah stretching golden beneath a sky that held too many stars, the jungle rising in the distance with trees that seemed to touch the heavens themselves. Panthers prowled through the tall grass, dozens of them, hundreds, their eyes glowing with the light of souls contained. And seated on thrones of twisted root and ancient stone, arranged in a semicircle that extended to the horizon, were the kings who had come before. Bashenga was there, mighty even in death, his presence radiating a power that transcended the physical. 100 generations of panthers surrounded him, each bearing the marks of their reign, scars, crowns, the ceremonial garments of their era. They watched T'Challa approach with eyes that judged every step, and at the centre, seated on the throne closest to where T'Challa stood, was T'Chaka. His father looked younger than T'Challa remembered. The lines of stress and sorrow that had marked his final years were gone. His robes were pristine, unmarked by the blood that had soaked them in his last moments. And his smile, that smile that T'Challa had feared he would never see again, spread across his face with the warmth of the African sun. "My son," T'Chaka said, "you have come." T'Challa fell to his knees before his father's throne. "Baba, I have missed you. Every day I have missed you." T'Chaka rose and descended to where his son knelt. He placed his hands on T'Challa's shoulders, lifted him to his feet, and embraced him with an intensity that transcended death itself. "I have watched you," T'Chaka said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have seen your struggles, your training, your hunt for the man who killed me. I have seen everything, and I am proud, so proud, my son." They stood together in that. They stood, timeless place, father and son reunited in a realm where grief had no power. The other ancestors watched in respectful silence. Even Bashenga, the first of their line, inclined his head in acknowledgement. "You must return," T'Chaka finally said, pulling back to look his son in the eyes. "Wakanda needs its king. The challenges ahead will be greater than anything our people have faced. You must be ready." "I will be," T'Challa said. "I swear it." And T'Challa, his father's expression grew serious. "The path of vengeance is seductive. I understand why you hunt Claw, but do not let hatred consume you. A king who rules through rage will destroy what he seeks to protect. Remember why you fight. Remember who you fight for." T'Challa nodded, though something in him rebelled against the council. Claw had murdered his father. Claw had violated Wakanda. Some crimes demanded vengeance regardless of the cost, but those thoughts were for later. Now there was only this moment, this last embrace, this final goodbye. "I love you, Baba," T'Challa whispered, "and I love you, my son. Now go. Become the king I always knew you could be." The ancestral plane dissolved, the purple light faded, and T'Challa gasped awake in the shallow grave by the waterfall, the shamans pulling him free of the earth that had held him, the sun blazing overhead with the promise of a new day. He felt different. Every sense was sharper. He could hear conversations happening on the cliffs above, could smell individual flowers in the jungle half a mile away, could feel the vibration of the waterfall in his bones like music. The herb had transformed him. He was no longer merely human, he was the Black Panther. The coronation ceremony followed, the placing of the crown, the donning of the vibranium weave habit, the oath sworn to the tribes and to Bast and to the ancestors who watched from beyond. Wakanda had a new king, and the new king had unfinished business. The world beyond Wakanda's borders moved in ignorance of its own limitations. T'Challa observed this truth during his first solo mission as the Black Panther, a hunt that had taken him from the jungles of the Congo to the glittering towers of Manhattan, following a trail of stolen vibranium that led inevitably back to Ulysses Claw. The smuggler had rebuilt himself in the years since their first encounter. The ruined hand had been replaced with a prosthetic sonic converter, more powerful than the weapon T'Challa had destroyed. Claw had accumulated resources, allies, protection from governments that valued his expertise more than they feared his crimes, and he had sold Wakandan vibranium to a scientist named Reed Richards. The Fantastic Four had purchased the metal through intermediaries, unaware of its true origin. Richards had used it in experiments that pushed the boundaries of physics, had published papers that came dangerously close to revealing properties that Wakanda had kept secret for millennia. When T'Challa learned of this, his response was immediate. He infiltrated the Baxter building. The security systems designed by Reed Richards, the man hailed as the greatest scientific mind of his generation, delayed T'Challa for approximately 90 seconds. He bypassed electronic locks, evaded motion sensors, neutralized guard robots, and reached Richards' primary laboratory before any alarm could be raised. He stood in the darkness, surrounded by the primitive technology of the outside world, and felt something he had not expected. Disappointment. These were the marvels of human civilization, these clunky machines, these inefficient designs, these systems that a moderately talented Wakandan engineer could have improved in an afternoon. T'Challa had known intellectually that the outside world lagged behind his nation, but knowing and seeing were different things. The gap was not merely significant, it was civilizational. Wakanda was not decades ahead of the rest of humanity, it was centuries ahead, millennia. And yet, when Reed Richards stumbled upon the intruder in his lab when the Fantastic Four mobilized to confront the unknown threat, T'Challa found himself facing something his technology could not easily overcome. Heart. The battle was brief but illuminating. Ben Grimm, the Thing as he was known, possessed strength that rivaled T'Challa's enhanced physiology. Johnny Storm's flames forced the Panther into defensive maneuvers that tested his suit's heat absorption capabilities. Sue Storm's invisible force fields created barriers that no amount of vibranium claws could penetrate. And Reed Richards himself, stretching his body into configurations that defied anatomy, proved surprisingly effective in close combat. T'Challa could have won. He was confident of that. His tactical assessment suggested a 67% probability of victory if he committed fully to lethal force. But he had not come to kill. He had come to investigate, to assess the threat, to determine whether these outsiders needed to be neutralized or could be redirected. He chose diplomacy. "I am T'Challa," he announced, retracting his claws, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "King of Wakanda, the vibranium you purchased was stolen from my people. I came to reclaim it, and to understand who had acquired it." The Fantastic Four exchanged glances. They had heard of Wakanda vaguely, a poor African nation with no particular significance on the world stage. The man standing before them in the advanced suit who had penetrated their security with contemptuous ease did not match that profile. What followed was a conversation that changed T'Challa's understanding of his place in the world. Reed Richards was brilliant. Not Wakandan-level brilliant, but brilliant nonetheless, with a curiosity that transcended ego and a genuine desire to use his abilities for good. Sue Storm possessed a wisdom that balanced her husband's intellectual obsessions. Johnny Storm, despite his immaturity, had courage that T'Challa could respect. And Ben Grimm, beneath his monstrous exterior, carried a nobility of spirit that shamed many who wore human faces. They were heroes, flawed, limited, operating with technology that Wakanda had surpassed before the pyramids were built, but heroes nonetheless. T'Challa returned to Wakanda with his recovered vibranium and something unexpected, an invitation to return. The Fantastic Four had offered their friendship, their alliance, their willingness to stand with him against threats that crossed borders and boundaries. He had accepted cautiously, uncertain what such an alliance might mean. Within a year, he had received a second invitation, this one from an organization that would test him in ways the Fantastic Four never had. The Avengers. Earth's mightiest heroes had formed in response to threats that no single champion could face alone. Their roster read like a mythology for the modern age. Thor, the Asgardian god of thunder, whose hammer channeled the power of storms. Iron Man, Tony Stark encased in armor that represented the pinnacle of what the outside world could achieve. Captain America, Steve Rogers, the living legend who had fought Nazis and emerged from the ice, unchanged in his commitment to justice. The Scarlet Witch, whose reality-warping powers defied scientific explanation. The Vision, an artificial being who had chosen to embrace humanity. Hawkeye, whose skill with a bow seemed almost supernatural in its precision. They had watched T'Challa's activities with interest. They had seen him dismantle criminal organizations, had noted his interventions in crises that spilled beyond Wakanda's borders, had assessed his capabilities and found them formidable. When an incursion of alien forces threatened the African continent, they had extended their invitation. T'Challa accepted. His first mission with the Avengers was chaos and glory intertwined. The aliens, a scouting force for a larger armada, had established a beachhead in the Sahara, and the assembled heroes had descended upon them with the fury of gods and monsters. T'Challa fought alongside Steve Rogers for the first time, the two of them moving in synchronization that felt almost instinctive, as if they had been training together for years rather than hours. He watched Thor summon lightning from a cloudless sky, watched Iron Man's repulsors carve trenches through enemy ranks, watched the Scarlet Witch reshape reality itself to trap alien warriors in loops of probability, and he proved himself. The tactical assessment came naturally. T'Challa saw patterns where others saw only violence, identified the enemy command structure, located their communication array, calculated the optimal strike points that would collapse their organization. He relayed this information to the team, and they responded with a precision that multiplied their effectiveness tenfold. The battle was won in hours rather than days. Afterward, in the debrief, Steve Rogers had approached him with an expression of respect that T'Challa had rarely seen directed at himself from outsiders. "You think differently than the rest of us," Rogers said. "You see the whole battlefield, not just the fight in front of you. We could use more of that." "I am a king," T'Challa replied. "I was trained to see nations, not battles. The principles scale." Rogers nodded slowly. "A king who fights in the mud alongside common soldiers. Your people are lucky to have you." "They are not common," T'Challa corrected, though not harshly. "No Wakandan is common. We are simply uncommon in our unity." A friendship formed that day, one that would endure through years of conflict, disagreement, and the complicated politics that arose when heroes from different worlds tried to work together. Steve Rogers became something T'Challa had not expected to find among the outsiders: a peer, a man whose moral compass matched his own, whose willingness to sacrifice for others mirrored the Wakandan ideal of a king who serves before he rules. Tony Stark was a different matter. The relationship between T'Challa and Stark was defined by mutual respect alloyed with constant friction. Both men were geniuses. Both were wealthy beyond measure. Both carried the weight of legacies that shaped their every decision. But where T'Challa approached problems with patient strategy, Stark favoured bold improvisation. Where T'Challa protected his nation through isolation, Stark broadcast his identity to the world and dared enemies to come for him. They argued, frequently, over tactics, over technology, over the fundamental question of whether transparency or secrecy better served the cause of justice. T'Challa found Stark's ego exhausting. Stark found T'Challa's reserve infuriating. And yet, when battle came, they fought together with an effectiveness that neither could have achieved alone. "You're the only person I've met who makes me feel like I'm playing catch-up," Stark admitted once, after T'Challa had casually improved the efficiency of his arc reactor by 14%. "I'm not sure if I hate you for that or respect you. Both are acceptable," T'Challa replied. "I feel much the same about your willingness to paint a target on your chest and call it heroism." The Avengers became a second responsibility, one that T'Challa balanced against his primary duty to Wakanda with an effort that few could have managed. He served on the team's rotating roster, appearing when global threats demanded his presence, withdrawing when his kingdom required his attention. He fought against Ultron, against Kang the Conqueror, against threats that range from alien invasions to demonic incursions to the machinations of mortal villains whose ambitions outstripped their wisdom. And through it all, he never forgot that he was a king first and an Avenger second. The tension was constant. The Council questioned his absences from Wakanda, questioned whether his involvement with outsiders compromised the secrecy that had protected them for millennia. The Avengers questioned his divided loyalties, questioned whether he could be trusted when Wakandan interests conflicted with global ones. T'Challa walked the line between worlds, belonging fully to neither, serving both with a dedication that left no room for rest. He was the panther who hunted beyond borders. He was the king who fought alongside legends, and he was beginning to understand that the isolation his ancestors had chosen could not last forever. The world was growing smaller. Threats were emerging that did not respect the holographic walls surrounding Wakanda. Eventually, his nation would have to choose: join the wider world or be overwhelmed by it. That choice, when it came, would tear him apart. But for now, he fought. He served. He proved, again and again, that the Black Panther belonged among Earth's mightiest heroes, not as a junior partner, not as a guest, but as an equal, whose contributions shaped the fate of the planet itself. The boy who had knelt in his father's blood had become something greater than vengeance. He had become a legend. The boy who would become Killmonger was born with a Wakandan name that meant "he who burns with purpose," N'Jadaka. His father, N'Jobu, was a prince of the Panther tribe, T'Chaka's own brother, younger by 3 years, raised in the same palace, trained by the same warriors, educated in the same traditions. The brothers had been close once, in the way that only those who share blood and expectation can be close. They had sparred together, studied together, debated the future of Wakanda in the quiet hours when the palace slept. N'Jobu had been present at T'Chaka's coronation, had been among the first to kneel before the new king, had sworn oaths of loyalty that he believed, at the time, he would never break. But N'Jobu had always seen the world differently than his brother. Where T'Chaka accepted the wisdom of isolation, N'Jobu questioned it. Where T'Chaka looked at the suffering of Africans beyond Wakanda's borders and saw tragedy beyond their power to address, Njobu saw betrayal, the deliberate abandonment of their own people. He watched the colonial powers carve up the continent, watched the slave trade rip millions from their homes, watched poverty and disease and war consume nations that shared ancestry with the hidden kingdom, and he burned. T'Chaka, sensing his brother's growing unrest, gave him a mission that he hoped would provide purpose without danger. Njobu was assigned to be a war dog, one of the deep cover operatives who monitored the outside world and reported back to the throne. His posting was Oakland, California, in the heart of the African-American community that had been built by the descendants of slaves. It was the worst assignment T'Chaka could have chosen. Njobu arrived in America and saw for the first time what had become of the diaspora. He saw poverty that would have been unimaginable in Wakanda. He saw violence, not the ritualized combat of warriors, but the desperate brutality of people fighting over crumbs. He saw children growing up without fathers, mothers working themselves to exhaustion, communities abandoned by every institution that claimed to serve them. He saw police officers treating black men like enemies of war. He saw prisons filling with young people whose only crime was being born into circumstances that offered no other path. And he saw in stark relief the obscenity of Wakandan isolation. His people, his true people, connected by blood and history and the shared wound of exploitation, were suffering. They had been suffering for centuries. And Wakanda, with its miracle metal and its technology that could have transformed the world, had done nothing. Had hidden behind holographic walls and congratulated itself on its survival, while its brothers and sisters died. Njobu's loyalty cracked, then shattered. He began, sharing Wakandan secrets with a man he should have arrested, Ulysses Klaue. The arms dealer was planning another raid on Wakanda, another attempt to steal the vibranium that had cost him his hand. Njobu provided intelligence, patrol routes, defense protocols, the locations of access points that the border tribe monitored less carefully. He told himself that Klaue's raid would force Wakanda to engage with the world, would shatter the isolation that had become a moral crime. He told himself that the ends justified the means. He was wrong. The raid failed. Klaue's forces were repelled, though not without cost. The attack that killed T'Chaka, the attack that scarred young T'Challa forever, was the direct result of Njobu's betrayal. When T'Chaka learned the truth, when the evidence of his brother's treachery was laid before him by Shuri, the war dog handler who had been embedded alongside Njobu, the king faced a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He confronted his brother in Oakland. He offered Njobu the chance to return to Wakanda, to face justice, to perhaps find redemption through service and sacrifice. Njobu refused. He drew his weapon, determined to fight his way free, to continue his mission of revolution by any means necessary. T'Chaka killed him. The panther's claws sank into his own brother's chest, and Njobu died on the floor of his Oakland apartment, surrounded by the posters and pamphlets of the liberation movements he had come to admire. His blood pooled on cheap carpet far from the gleaming floors of the palace where he had been born. And in the next room, hiding in a closet, a young boy heard everything, Njadaka. T'Chaka made a decision in that moment that would prove catastrophic. He chose to leave the boy behind. The child was evidence of Njobu's betrayal, a half-American son whose existence proved that the prince had violated his sacred duties in multiple ways. Bringing him to Wakanda would raise questions, would require explanations, would tarnish the memory of the royal line. Easier to leave him, easier to pretend he did not exist. The king returned to Wakanda alone. He told no one the full truth of what had happened. He allowed history to record that Njobu had died in the line of duty, a loyal war dog who had given his life for his nation. The lie was seamless. The lie was devastating. Njadaka grew up in the Oakland foster care system, passed from home to home, carrying a grief and rage that no counselor could address because no counselor knew its true source. He remembered his father's stories about the hidden kingdom. He remembered the ring his father had worn, a royal signet that Njadaka had taken from the cooling corpse before the authorities arrived. He remembered the sound of claws tearing through flesh, and he swore vengeance. The boy remade himself into a weapon. He excelled in school despite the chaos of his home life, earning scholarships that took him to Annapolis and then to the most elite special operations units the American military possessed. He served in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in a dozen Black Ops theaters that official records did not acknowledge. He killed. He learned to kill efficiently, creatively, without hesitation or remorse. Each notch on his skin, the ritual scars he gave himself for every life he took, brought him closer to his goal. He took a new name, a war name, a name that captured what he intended to become, Eric Killmonger. He found Ulysses Claw. The arms dealer had rebuilt his operation since the failed Wakanda raid, had become wealthy beyond imagination through the sale of weapons to anyone who could pay. Killmonger approached him not as an enemy, but as an ally, a fellow traveller with shared interests, shared enemies, shared hunger. Together they planned what Claw had been unable to achieve alone. A return to Wakanda, a final reckoning. The attack came on a day when T'Challa was abroad, dealing with an Avengers crisis that had demanded his attention. Killmonger and Claw penetrated the border defences using intelligence that had been updated since Njobu's time. Information gathered through patient surveillance, through agents planted over years, through a meticulous preparation that Claw alone would never have managed. They reached the palace. They reached the throne room. And there, Killmonger did something that shocked even his partner. He killed Ulysses Claw. One clean shot, no hesitation. The body of the man who had murdered T'Chaka, who had set in motion the chain of events that destroyed Njobu's life and Njadaka's childhood, hit the floor with a thud that echoed off the vibranium walls. A gift, Killmonger announced to the assembled council, to the Dora Milaje who surrounded him with weapons ready, to the royal family who stared at this stranger with horror and confusion. A gift for the throne I've come to claim. He held up his father's ring. He told them who he was. He told them what T'Chaka had done. And he invoked the ancient right of challenge. T'Challa returned to find his world inverted. The cousin he had never known existed was demanding combat at Warrior Falls. The secret his father had kept for decades was exposed, shattering the image of the noble king who had died a martyr. The council was divided, some calling for Killmonger's immediate execution, others acknowledging that his claim was technically legitimate, that the old laws gave him the right to fight for the throne. T'Challa accepted the challenge. He had no choice. They met at the sacred pool, the same waters where T'Challa had defeated M'Baku, where generations of kings had proven their worth through combat. The sun blazed overhead. The tribes gathered on the cliffs, and for the first time, T'Challa faced an opponent who matched him in every dimension. Killmonger had trained his entire life for this moment. He had studied Wakandan martial arts through recovered videos, through stolen manuals, through interrogations of captured war dogs who had not known they were educating their own executioner. He had built his body into a perfect machine. He had fed his rage until it burned with the intensity of a fusion reactor. The fight was brutal. T'Challa had the heart-shaped herb. He had the enhanced strength, the superhuman speed, the senses that detected every shift in his opponent's weight. But Killmonger had something T'Challa lacked, a willingness to cross lines that the king would not cross. He fought dirty. He exploited every moment of hesitation, every flicker of doubt, every instance where T'Challa's nobility became a weakness, and he won. The moment came when T'Challa overextended, when his concern for a Dora Milaje who had stumbled into the combat zone distracted him for a fraction of a second. Killmonger's fist caught him in the throat. His knee drove into T'Challa's midsection. And before the king could recover, Killmonger had lifted him overhead, had carried him to the edge. Of the falls, had spoken words that would haunt T'Challa for years to come. Your father killed my father. Your family abandoned me. Your nation let my people suffer while you hid in your golden city. This is justice. He threw T'Challa over the edge. The falls swallowed the king. The current dragged him under, smashed him against rocks, carried him miles downstream into territory where even the border tribe rarely ventured. By all rights, he should have died. The injuries alone, broken ribs, ruptured organs, a skull fracture that would have killed any normal man instantly, should have ended his story. But the heart-shaped herb was not finished with him. The Jabari found him. M'Baku's people, the mountain tribe who had rejected vibranium, who had retreated from Wakandan society, who owed T'Challa nothing. They pulled his broken body from the river and carried him to their hidden fortress in the peaks. They packed his wounds with snow. They fed him broths made from mountain herbs. They did not do this out of love or loyalty. They did it because M'Baku saw an opportunity. The usurper is not fit to rule. Baku told T'Challa, when the king finally regained consciousness. He speaks of war, of conquest, of using Wakanda's weapons to burn the world. If he succeeds, the Jabari will be dragged into conflicts we want no part of. You will stop him, or I will, and claim the throne for myself. Meanwhile, in Burninzana, Killmonger's reign had begun. He consumed the heart-shaped herb, though the experience was not what he had expected. The ancestral plane rejected him. His father was there, Njobu, waiting in the purple twilight, but the other kings turned away. He was not their chosen. He was an aberration, a wound in the royal line, tolerated only because the old laws demanded it. Killmonger did not care. He had not come for ancestral approval. He had come for power. His orders were immediate and devastating. Wakandan weapons were to be distributed to oppressed peoples across the globe. War dogs in every major city were to arm local resistance movements, to spark revolutions that would topple governments and reshape the world order. Wakanda would emerge from hiding not as a benevolent neighbour, but as a conquering liberator, imposing justice at the point of a vibranium spear. The shipments were loading when T'Challa returned. He came through the mine shafts, the ancient tunnels that predated the Golden City, guided by Nakia and Shuri and the Loyalists who had refused to accept the usurper's rule. He came armed with weapons the Jabari had provided, primitive by Wakandan standards, but effective nonetheless. He came with a single purpose burning in his heart, not vengeance. He had learned something in his time among the Jabari, in the quiet hours of recovery when he had nothing to do but think. Killmonger was not wrong, not entirely. T'Chaka had made terrible choices. Wakanda had failed the diaspora. The isolation that had protected them had also become a form of complicity in the suffering of others. But Killmonger's solution, war, conquest, the imposition of Wakandan dominance on the entire planet, was not justice. It was rage wearing the mask of righteousness. It would create more suffering than it ended. It would transform Wakanda from a hidden paradise into a global tyrant. T'Challa came to stop him, and he came to offer something else. The challenge never ended, T'Challa declared, standing in the throne room where his father had died, facing the cousin who had thrown him to what should have been his death. I never yielded. I never died. By the old laws I am still king, and I demand the right to finish what we started. Killmonger's smile was all teeth. I was hoping you'd say that. They fought again. This time there were no witnesses, no ritual boundaries, no rules of engagement. They fought through the palace, through the laboratories, through the vibranium mines where the heart of Wakanda's power pulsed, in the earth. They fought with claws and fists and improvised weapons torn from the walls, and this time T'Challa won. Not through superior skill, they were too evenly matched for that. Not through superior strength, the herb gave them equal enhancement. He won because in the final moment Killmonger hesitated. They stood at the edge of the mineshaft, overlooking the reactor core that powered the entire city. Killmonger had T'Challa in a grip that could have been fatal. One twist, one application of pressure, and the king's neck would snap. But instead of finishing the kill, Killmonger spoke. "Do you know what I would have been?" he said, his voice cracking with something that might have been grief. "If your father had taken me with him, if I had grown up here instead of in Oakland, I could have been you. I could have been king without having to fight for it. I could have belonged somewhere." It was the hesitation T'Challa needed. He broke the grip, reversed the position, drove, his blade into Killmonger's chest. The wound was mortal. They both knew it. T'Challa carried his cousin to the mouth of the mineshaft, to a ledge where the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Killmonger's breathing was shallow, his blood pooling beneath them, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "The sunsets here," Killmonger murmured. "My father told me about them. He said they were the most beautiful in the world." "They are," T'Challa said. "I could heal you," he added after a moment. "Our technology, nah." Killmonger's smile was faint but genuine. "Bury me in the ocean, with my ancestors who jumped from the ships, because they knew death was better than bondage." He died watching the sunset he had never been allowed to see as a child, and T'Challa knelt beside his body and wept, not for his enemy, for his cousin, for the boy who had been abandoned, who had been shaped by grief into a weapon, who had been right about so many things even as he was catastrophically wrong about how to fix them. Killmonger would return. Resurrection was not beyond Wakandan technology, and there were those who would see value in bringing back such a potent warrior, but that first death, that first ending, marked a turning point that could not be reversed. T'Challa burned the heart-shaped herb gardens himself, ensuring that no future usurper could seize the Panther's power. He opened Wakanda's borders, established outreach centers in Oakland and cities around the world, began the process of sharing Wakandan technology with those who needed it most. He did this not to honor Killmonger's memory, but to answer Killmonger's critique. The isolation was over. Wakanda would no longer watch the world suffer from behind holographic walls, and T'Challa would carry the weight of his cousin's death and his cousin's truth for the rest of his reign. Killmonger was the wound that cut deepest, but he was far from the only predator who circled the throne of Wakanda. The Hidden Kingdom had survived for 10,000 years not merely because of its technological superiority or its vibranium wealth, but because generation after generation of Black Panthers had defended it against threats both external and internal. Some of these enemies came from beyond the borders: arms dealers, would-be conquerors, governments that glimpsed the truth of Wakanda's power and hungered to possess it. Others emerged from within, born of the ancient tribal tensions that unity had suppressed but never truly erased. M'Baku had been the first to challenge T'Challa at Warrior Falls, and though he had yielded that day, his ambitions had not died with his defeat. The Lord of the Jabari was a paradox that few outsiders understood. He rejected vibranium technology with a fervour that bordered on religious conviction, yet he was no primitive. The Jabari had developed their own traditions, their own sciences, their own ways of enhancing human capability that did not depend on alien metal. They trained their bodies through techniques passed down for millennia: exposure to extreme cold that triggered metabolic adaptations, diets of rare mountain herbs that strengthened bone and sinew, combat forms that maximized the power of unaugmented muscle. A Jabari warrior in peak condition could match a heart-shaped herb-enhanced panther for short bursts, relying on raw physical development rather than chemical enhancement. M'Baku himself was the culmination of this tradition. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his body a monument to disciplined suffering. The scars that covered his chest and arms were not merely decorative. Each one marked a trial survived, a limit exceeded, a weakness burned away. He had killed a white gorilla in single combat, the most sacred and forbidden act in Jabari culture, and had consumed its flesh to claim the power of the gorilla god Hanuman. This made him both a hero and a heretic to his own people, a leader who had proven his strength through blasphemy. His relationship with T'Challa evolved over years of conflict and reluctant cooperation. After the Killmonger crisis, when the Jabari had saved the king's life, a debt existed between them that neither could ignore. M'Baku had no interest in ruling all of Wakanda. The lowlands were corrupt, in his view, tainted by their dependence on vibranium, but he demanded respect for Jabari autonomy, demanded a voice in decisions that affected the nation as a whole. T'Challa granted both, though the negotiations were bitter. "You think because you wear the panther's skin you understand strength," M'Baku told him, during one particularly heated council session. "You have never known what it means to build power from nothing, to refuse the easy path, to suffer for every advantage while your rivals are handed theirs by alien rocks and dead gods. And you think isolation makes you righteous," T'Challa replied. "The Jabari have watched our people struggle with the same contempt that Wakanda showed the outside world. We are both guilty of the same sin. The only question is whether we can move beyond it." They never became friends, but they became something perhaps more valuable: rivals who respected each other enough to fight together when the situation demanded it. Other internal threats were less amenable to negotiation. The White Wolf came for T'Challa in the 3rd year of his reign, emerging from shadows that the new king had not known existed. His name was Hunter, and he was T'Chaka's first son, though not by blood. Hunter had been the sole survivor of a plane crash in Wakandan territory, a white infant found screaming in the wreckage while his parents' bodies cooled nearby. T'Chaka, moved by compassion that his advisors considered foolish, had adopted the boy and raised him as a prince of Wakanda. It was an experiment that produced complicated results. Hunter had grown up desperate to prove his belonging. He had trained harder than any native-born warrior, had mastered Wakandan combat forms with a ferocity that disturbed his instructors, had devoted himself to his adoptive nation with an intensity that bordered on obsession. But no matter how much he achieved, he could never fully escape the whispers: the White Prince, the outsider, the boy who looked like the colonizers who had raped the rest of Africa while Wakanda hid. T'Chaka had recognized Hunter's capabilities and channeled them into a role that suited his nature. He had made Hunter the leader of the Hattutsaraze, the Dogs of War, Wakanda's secret police. They were the dark mirror of the Dora Milaje, operating in shadows rather than light, handling the tasks that no honourable warrior would touch: assassination, torture, the disappearance of dissidents who threatened national security. Hunter had embraced this role with grim enthusiasm, becoming the white wolf who hunted in the night. Then T'Challa was born. Hunter watched his position as air evaporate overnight. The adopted son could never inherit, that had always been understood. But as long as T'Chaka had no biological children, Hunter had been next in the line of succession by default. T'Challa's birth relegated him to irrelevance. The boy he had imagined as a younger brother became instead a living reminder of everything Hunter would never be. He served loyally nonetheless. He led the Hattutsarase with brutal efficiency, protecting Wakanda through methods that T'Chaka preferred not to examine too closely. When the king died, when T'Challa inherited, Hunter had expected that his service would continue unchanged. He was wrong. T'Challa disbanded the Hattutsarase within his first month as king. The organization's methods were incompatible with the values he intended to uphold. The secret police were given the choice of integrating into the regular military or departing Wakanda entirely. Hunter chose departure, but not exile. He took the most loyal of his agents and vanished into the international underworld, offering their services to the highest bidder. They became mercenaries, assassins, intelligence operatives whose knowledge of Wakandan systems made them invaluable to foreign powers. Hunter told himself he was building resources, gathering strength, waiting for the moment when he could return and claim what should have been his. That moment came in the form of an alliance with a man whose madness made even Hunter uncomfortable: Achebe. No one knew Achebe's true name or origin. The stories varied wildly. He had been a farmer whose village was destroyed in a civil war, a scholar who had lost his mind to demonic possession, a comedian who had taken his act too far and never found his way back to sanity. What was certain was that he had appeared in Wakanda during a period of transition, inserting himself into the political apparatus with a skill that suggested long planning, and had very nearly destroyed the nation from within. His weapon was chaos. Achebe understood, something that more straightforward villains missed. Wakanda's greatest vulnerability was its own complexity. The tribal system, the technological infrastructure, the delicate balance between tradition and innovation, all of these could be turned against themselves with the right application of pressure. He did not attack with armies or weapons. He attacked with rumours, with forged documents, with carefully orchestrated crises that forced T'Challa to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. At one point, Achebe had actually succeeded in claiming the throne, not through combat but through a bureaucratic coup that exploited loopholes in succession law that had not been relevant for centuries. He had ruled for 17 days, cackling with glee as he issued contradictory orders and watched the nation's systems grind toward dysfunction. T'Challa had been forced to challenge him at Warrior Falls to reclaim his crown through the ancient ritual rather than through the modern legal mechanisms that Achebe had corrupted. The fight had been anticlimactic. Achebe was no warrior, and he had yielded almost immediately, but the damage he had inflicted during his brief reign took months to repair. The mad priest remained a persistent threat, appearing and disappearing according to patterns that no intelligence analysis could predict. He seemed to have no coherent goal beyond the pleasure he took in disruption. He was Wakanda's Joker, a wild card whose only consistent trait was his commitment to chaos. External threats were, in some ways, easier to address. Claw's death had not ended the hunger of outsiders for Wakandan vibranium. The metal was simply too valuable, too transformative, too capable of reshaping the global balance of power for would-be conquerors to ignore. Corporate raiders, rogue states, and supervillains all took their turns probing Wakanda's defences. Dr. Doom visited twice. The Lord of Latveria approached Wakanda not as an invader but as a fellow, monarch, offering alliances and trade agreements that would have benefited both nations. T'Challa recognised the trap beneath the honey. Doom's history of deception was too well documented to ignore. But he also recognized that dismissing the Latverian entirely would create an enemy he did not need. Their relationship settled into a pattern of wary mutual respect. They exchanged technological innovations through carefully controlled channels. They maintained diplomatic relations that neither fully trusted, and they watched each other constantly, each waiting for the moment when the other would reveal his true intentions. "You are the only king I consider my equal," Doom told T'Challa during their second meeting, his iron mask hiding whatever expression accompanied the words. "This is not flattery, it is assessment. Wakanda and Latveria are the only nations on Earth that have achieved true independence. Freedom not merely from colonial masters, but from the entire system of dependency that chains lesser countries to the whims of superpowers. And yet you seek to conquer the world," T'Challa replied. "That suggests your independence is not enough for you." "Independence is never enough," Doom said. "Security is what matters, and security requires control. The question is not whether I will rule, it is whether I will rule wisely. On that question, I suspect you and I have more in common than either of us would prefer to admit." They parted as neither friends nor enemies, but as predators who had measured each other and decided that the hunt was not yet worth the risk. The rogues of Wakanda, internal and external, mad and calculating, driven by ideology or greed or wounds that would never heal, tested T'Challa without end. Each victory taught him something, each defeat carved lessons into his flesh. He learned that a king could not protect his people by strength alone, that politics and perception, and the careful management of competing interests mattered as much as vibranium claws and superhuman reflexes. He learned that the throne was not a prize to be won, but a burden to be carried, and he carried it, day after day, year after year, while the enemies circled and the challenges multiplied and the crown grew heavier with each passing season. This was the price of kingship. This was the cost of being the Black Panther. She was 12 years old when he first saw her, and she was stealing to survive. The Cairo marketplace churned with bodies and noise, merchants hawking their wares in a dozen languages, tourists clutching their bags against the pickpockets everyone knew were lurking, locals navigating the chaos with the resigned efficiency of people who had grown up in it. T'Challa, himself only a few years older, had been sent by his father on what T'Chaka called a learning expedition, a chance to see the world beyond Wakanda's borders, to understand the peoples his nation had chosen to hide from. He noticed her because she moved wrong. Wrong for a street child, that is. The other pickpockets worked in clusters, using distraction and numbers to cover their extractions. This girl worked alone. She flowed through the crowd like water through rocks, her fingers dipping into pockets and bags with a precision that spoke of either extraordinary training or something more. T'Challa watched her lift 3 wallets in 90 seconds without a single mark noticing. Then she made a mistake. A merchant saw her take a piece of fruit from his stall. He grabbed her wrist, shouting accusations, drawing attention. A crowd began to form, the ugly energy of people who had found a target for their frustrations. The girl struggled, her white hair catching the sunlight in a way that marked her as different, as other, as fair game. T'Challa intervened without thinking. He paid for the fruit. He paid for the wallets she had stolen, returning them to their owners, with apologies delivered in flawless Arabic. He extracted the girl from the situation with a diplomatic skill that surprised even himself, guiding her through side streets until they reached a quiet courtyard where fountain water masked their conversation from listening ears. "You did not have to do that," she said. Her voice was rough, defensive, the voice of someone who had learned that kindness always came with a price. "No," T'Challa agreed. "I didn't have to. I chose to." "Why?" He considered the question. The honest answer was that he did not know. That something in the way she had moved, the way she had carried herself even while stealing, had spoken to him of kinship. She was a predator, like him, a survivor, and predators should not be destroyed by sheep. "Because you are more than what they see," he said finally, "and I wanted you to know that someone noticed." Her name was Aurora. She told him this as the afternoon faded into evening, as they shared the fruit she'd stolen, and he told her carefully edited stories about where he came from. She was an orphan, her parents killed years ago in a plane crash that had buried her alive for 3 days, leaving her with claustrophobia so severe she could not enter small spaces without feeling her lungs constrict. She had survived on the street since then, developing abilities that she did not fully understand, powers that manifested when her emotions grew too strong. "Watch," she said, and raised her hand toward the sky. The clouds gathered from nowhere. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and for a moment, just a moment, rain fell on that single courtyard while the rest of Cairo baked in the desert sun. T'Challa stared. He had seen Wakandan technology perform feats that would seem miraculous to outsiders. But this was not technology. This was something else entirely. "You are a goddess," he breathed. Aurora laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him. "I am a thief, and I am hungry. Come, I know where we can find better food than stolen fruit." They spent 3 days together. They explored Cairo's hidden corners, sharing stories, building a connection that neither of them could quite explain. On the last night, beneath stars that Aurora commanded to shine brighter through a gap she created in the clouds, they kissed. The awkward, electric first kiss of adolescents who had discovered something precious and did not know what to do with it. Then T'Challa was recalled to Wakanda, and they were separated by an ocean and a lifetime of diverging paths. He thought of her often in the years that followed. He heard rumors of a weather goddess in Kenya who protected villages from drought. He read reports, compiled by war dogs, of an African woman who had joined a team of American mutants called the X-Men. He saw her face on news broadcasts, saw her fighting alongside heroes whose names were becoming legends. Aurora, Storm now, the name fitting her like a crown she'd grown into, had become something magnificent. She had taken the frightened power of her childhood and forged it into a force that could reshape the world. She was a queen among mutants, respected and feared in equal measure. And T'Challa was a king. They reunited in the aftermath of a crisis that had brought the X-Men to Wakanda's borders. The meeting was diplomatic at first, 2 leaders negotiating the terms of cooperation against a shared threat. But beneath the formality, the spark that had ignited in Cairo still burned. "You became what I always knew you could be," T'Challa told her, when they finally found a moment alone. "As did you," Aurora replied, "though I confess I did not expect you to be a king. You spoke of your home as if it were a small place, a village perhaps, not this." She gestured at the gleaming spires of Bir Ninzana, visible through the window of the chamber where they stood. "I was protecting its secrets. Even then, I was protecting them. And now? Now I'm tired of secrets. Now I want to share everything with someone who can understand." The courtship that followed was unlike anything the world had seen. The king of the most advanced nation on Earth pursuing the weather goddess of the X-Men, it was a union that transcended politics, that merged 2 legacies into something potentially transformative. Diplomatic implications aside, they simply loved each other with the pure intensity of people who had found their equals. The wedding was held in Wakanda, attended by heroes and dignitaries from across the globe. Storm wore traditional Wakandan bridal garments that had been modified to incorporate the lightning motifs of her mutant identity. T'Challa wore the ceremonial robes of kings, with the panther habit visible beneath, a reminder that even on this day of celebration, he remained the protector of his people. They exchanged vows that had not been spoken at a Wakandan royal wedding in generations, vows that acknowledged both partners as sovereigns in their own right, neither subordinate to the other. Aurora became Queen of Wakanda, but she did not become T'Challa's subject. She remained an X-Man. She retained her autonomy. For a time, it seemed like they had achieved the impossible, a marriage that balanced the demands of kingdom and team, of duty and love, of 2 extraordinary individuals who refused to diminish themselves for the sake of union. They fought together, combining her mastery of weather with his tactical genius to defeat threats that neither could have handled alone. They ruled together, Aurora's outsider perspective offering insights that T'Challa's immersion in Wakandan tradition might have missed. They loved together, finding in each other a completeness that neither had experienced before, but the world does not stop testing those it finds worthy. The Phoenix Force descended on Earth, possessing 5 of the most powerful X-Men alive, and one of those 5 was Namor, the king of Atlantis, whose hatred of Wakanda had simmered for years. What happened next would shatter the marriage that had seemed unbreakable. Namor, corrupted by cosmic fire, turned his fury on Wakanda. He summoned a tidal wave that drowned the Golden City, that killed thousands, that inflicted wounds on T'Challa's nation that would take decades to heal. And Aurora Aurora was aligned with the X-Men who had received the Phoenix's power. She had not participated in the attack. She had not known it was coming. But she was connected, however tenuously, to the force that had destroyed T'Challa's home. The marriage could not survive. T'Challa annulled their union in the aftermath of the flood, citing irreconcilable differences that were really something simpler and more devastating. He could not look at his wife without seeing the drowned faces of his people. He could not love her without feeling that lover's betrayal. He could not be her husband and be the king Wakanda needed in its darkest hour. Aurora accepted the annulment with a dignity that made T'Challa's heart ache. She understood. That was the worst part. She understood completely. The same qualities that had made her worthy of being his queen made her capable of recognizing when that role had become impossible. "I will always love you," she told him, as she prepared to leave Wakanda for the last time as its queen. "That will never change." "Nor will my love for you," T'Challa replied. "But love is not always enough." "No," Aurora agreed. "Sometimes it is everything, and sometimes it is not nearly enough." She departed on winds that she commanded herself, rising into the sky like the goddess she had always been, leaving behind a king who stood alone on a balcony, overlooking a city still scarred by flood damage. They would fight together again in years to come. They would speak as allies, as friends, as people who had once been more and could never quite forget it. But the marriage was over. The dream of two kingdoms united had drowned along with the Golden City. T'Challa had chosen his people over his heart. It was the choice a king had to make. It was the choice that left him, in the quiet hours of the night, wondering if anything was worth such a price. The invitation came wrapped in secrecy so absolute that even Wakanda's intelligence apparatus had not detected its source. A holographic message delivered through channels that should not have existed, bearing the signatures of 6 individuals whose combined power could reshape the planet. Tony Stark, Reed Richards, Stephen Strange, Charles Xavier, Black Bolt of the Inhumans, Namor of Atlantis. They called themselves the Illuminati, a name chosen with deliberate irony, a nod to the conspiracy theories that obsessed the paranoid, while the real conspiracy operated in plain sight. They wanted T'Challa to join them. The meeting took place in a pocket dimension, accessible only through sorcery, a neutral ground where no surveillance could reach and no eavesdroppers could intrude. T'Challa arrived to find 6 of the most powerful individuals on Earth seated around a circular table, their faces illuminated by the strange light of a realm that existed outside normal space and time. "We've watched you for years," Tony Stark began, his armor retracted to show his face, his expression carrying the weight of decisions that haunted his sleep. "You're one of the few people on this planet who understands what we're trying to do, who sees the threats that governments can't acknowledge and the public can't comprehend." "What you're trying to do," T'Challa replied, his voice carefully neutral, "is rule the world from the shadows. You have gathered here the leaders of nations, the masters of powers beyond human comprehension, and you make decisions that affect billions without their knowledge or consent. This is not protection. This is oligarchy." Reed Richards leaned forward, his elastic features stretching in ways that normal human musculature could not accommodate. "It's necessity, the threats we face. Cosmic entities, interdimensional invasions, extinction-level events, cannot be addressed through democratic processes. By the time the United Nations debates a response to Galactus, the planet is already consumed. We act because no one else can act fast enough. And when you act wrongly, when your brilliant minds make mistakes that cost millions of lives, who holds you accountable?" "Each other," Stephen Strange said. The Sorcerer Supreme's eyes held depths that spoke of knowledge no mortal should possess. "That is why we need you, T'Challa. You are the conscience we lack. You see the moral dimensions that the rest of us in our arrogance sometimes overlook." T'Challa studied each face around the table. Stark, whose ego was matched only by his genuine desire to protect the innocent. Richards, whose intellect had elevated him beyond normal human concerns in ways that sometimes bordered on sociopathy. Strange, who had sacrificed everything for power he never wanted. Xavier, whose dream of human-mutant coexistence had been tested to breaking by decades of persecution. Black Bolt, whose mere whisper could level cities, sitting in eternal silence to protect those around him. And Namor. The King of Atlantis met T'Challa's gaze with an expression of barely concealed contempt. Their nations had been rivals for generations, their personal relationship defined by clashes that had never quite escalated to open war. Namor's presence at this table was itself a warning, proof that the Illuminati valued capability over compatibility, power over principle. "I decline," T'Challa said. He turned and walked away from the table, from the offer of power beyond imagination, from the opportunity to shape the destiny of the human race. The pocket dimension folded around him, returning him to Wakanda with the taste of refusal fresh on his tongue. He had made the right choice. He was certain of it. For 3 years that certainty held. Then the incursions began. The first. Warning came from Reed Richards, a transmission so heavily encrypted that even Wakandan technology struggled to decode it. The message was simple and devastating. The multiverse was dying. Parallel Earths were colliding with each other, their impacts annihilating both realities. The phenomenon was accelerating, and eventually, inevitably, their Earth would be caught in the destruction. T'Challa did not believe it. He assigned his best scientists to analyze Richards' data, expecting them to find errors, exaggerations, the paranoid fantasies of a mind that had spent too long contemplating cosmic horrors. Instead, they confirmed everything. The incursions were real. The timeline was shorter than Richards had estimated, and there was no solution that did not involve impossible choices. T'Challa reconsidered his refusal. He joined the Illuminati not as a believer, but as a watchdog, determined to ensure that the decisions made in those secret chambers reflected something more than cold calculation. He brought Wakandan resources to bear on the incursion problem, his nation's scientists working alongside Richards and Stark to develop countermeasures that might save both colliding Earths. They found none. The mathematics were brutal in their clarity. When 2 Earths collided, both were destroyed. The only way to save one was to destroy the other first, to reach across the dimensional barrier and annihilate a planet full of billions of innocent people. People who had done nothing wrong, whose only crime was existing in a universe that had drifted too close to another. "We have to build the weapons," Stark argued, his face haggard with sleeplessness. "Even if we never use them, we have to have the option. The option to commit genocide," T'Challa's voice was ice. "The option to murder worlds. The option to survive. If an incursion happens and we have no way to respond, everyone dies. Both Earths. 8 billion people here, 8 billion people there. 16 billion. Total. But if we act, if we make the impossible choice, 8 billion survive. It's mathematics, T'Challa. It's the trolley problem scaled to cosmic proportions. It is murder. Dress it however you wish. It remains murder." The argument consumed months. Weapons were designed but not built. Strategies were debated but not implemented. And all the while, the incursions continued. Parallel Earths died in fire and silence, their populations snuffed out in instants, their histories erased as if they had never existed. Then an incursion targeted their Earth. T'Challa stood on a platform suspended in dimensional space, watching another version of their planet drift closer. Through the instruments the Illuminati had constructed, he could see cities on that other Earth. Cities full of people going about their lives, unaware that annihilation approached. Children playing in parks, lovers walking hand in hand, elderly couples watching sunsets they did not know would be their last. The weapon was ready. A dimensional bomb capable of destroying the other Earth before the collision occurred. One button, one decision, 8 billion deaths to prevent 16 billion. "I cannot," T'Challa said. He stepped away from the controls. He watched as the other Illuminati members argued, as Namor seized the weapon with a snarl of contempt, as Strange and Richards tried to calculate alternatives that did not exist. In the end, it was Namor who pushed the button. The other Earth died in a flash of light that would have been beautiful if it had not been the funeral pyre of a civilization. T'Challa watched it burn and felt something inside himself crack. Not break, not yet, but crack in ways that would never fully heal. "You are weak," Namor said afterward, his voice dripping with disdain. "You would have let us all die rather than soil your precious conscience." "And you are a monster," T'Challa replied. "You murdered a world without hesitation. I saved a world without hesitation. The difference is perspective." The Illuminati fractured along fault lines that had always existed beneath the surface. T'Challa withdrew from their meetings, disgusted by what they had become willing to do. But he did not stop preparing. In the deepest vaults of Wakanda, he built weapons of his own. Dimensional bombs, world killers, instruments of genocide that he told himself he would never use, that he was constructing only as a last resort, only as insurance against scenarios too terrible to contemplate. He worked alone, trusting no one with the knowledge of what he was creating. The cognitive dissonance was extraordinary. He had condemned Namor for pushing the button, while simultaneously building buttons of his own. This was the truth that T'Challa could not escape. He was not better than the others. He was simply better at lying to himself. When the Illuminati discovered his secret arsenal, they expelled him from the group. The irony was exquisite, cast out by murderers for preparing to commit murder. T'Challa accepted the judgment without protest. He had no moral ground to stand on. None of them did. Namor, meanwhile, had reached his own conclusions about the insufficiency of the Illuminati's approach. He formed a new group, the Cabal, composed of villains and monsters who had no qualms about destroying worlds. Thanos, Proxima Midnight, Corvus Glaive, Black Swan. They would do what the Illuminati could not stomach, would push the buttons without hesitation or regret. The multiverse continued to die around them, Earth after Earth, universe after universe. The walls between realities were collapsing, and nothing the heroes built could stop the collapse. They were not fighting an enemy, they were fighting entropy itself, the fundamental tendency of existence to wind down into nothingness. In the end, the incursions consumed everything. The final incursion pitted Earth against Earth in a confrontation that no weapon could resolve. The multiverse collapsed into a singularity, destroying all realities simultaneously. Everything T'Challa had fought to protect, Wakanda, his people, his sister, his legacy, vanished in an instant of cosmic annihilation. He should have died with the rest. But the universe, it seemed, was not finished with him. When existence rebuilt itself, through mechanisms that even Reed Richards could barely comprehend, T'Challa emerged into a new reality that remembered the old. The multiverse had been restored, though scarred by what had happened. The dead returned to life, though not all of them, and not unchanged. T'Challa carried memories of choices he had made and choices he had refused to make. He remembered standing before the controls of a world killer and stepping away. He remembered building his own world killers in secret vaults. He remembered the face of Namor as the Atlantean pushed the button that saved their Earth by murdering another. He remembered being asked to commit genocide, and refusing. He remembered preparing to commit genocide anyway. The experience had taught him something that no amount of training or tradition could have conveyed. That moral purity was impossible when the stakes reached cosmic scale, that sometimes the choice was not between right and wrong, but between different flavors of wrong. That a king who refused to dirty his hands might doom his people through that very refusal. He did not become a monster. He did not abandon his principles, but he understood now why monsters existed. He understood the pressures that transformed good men into devils, and he understood that he would face those pressures again, in different forms, for as long as he wore the crown. The Illuminati had been wrong about many things, but they had been right about one. Some decisions could not wait for democratic debate. Some threats required kings willing to bear burdens that no voting populace would ever choose. T'Challa returned to Wakanda carrying the weight of murdered worlds on his shoulders, wondering if any amount of good deeds could ever balance the scales. He won. The details of that victory fill archives that would take lifetimes to read. Battles on alien worlds, diplomatic negotiations with species humanity had never contacted, sacrifices made by heroes whose names would never be spoken on Earth. What matters is the outcome. The tyranny fell. The Maroons were freed. And T'Challa, for a time, wore a title that no Wakandan had ever held. Emperor. He did not keep it. The title was a burden he had never sought, a responsibility that belonged to the people he had liberated rather than the man who had led their liberation. He established democratic institutions, trained leaders, built systems that would outlast any individual ruler. And then he came home. The T'Challa who returned to Earth was different from the one who had left. He had seen civilizations that made humanity look young. He had fought enemies whose power dwarfed anything the Avengers had faced. He had ruled an empire and chosen to let it go. The perspectives he brought back, the knowledge, the connections, the understanding of humanity's place in a cosmos far larger and stranger than anyone had imagined, would shape Wakanda's future for generations to come. The boy who had knelt in his father's blood had become something beyond definition. King, avenger, revolutionary, emperor, husband, though that marriage had ended. Brother, bound to Shuri by ties stronger than politics. Son of T'Chaka, carrying his father's legacy while forging something entirely new. The Black Panther. The title had been worn by hundreds before him. It would be worn by hundreds after. But T'Challa had given it meaning that transcended tradition, had proven that a protector could be more than a guardian of borders, that a king could serve not just his nation but his species, that the mantle forged in African soil could stretch across the stars themselves. Wakanda stood in the light now. No more hiding, no more holographic walls. The world knew what they were, knew what they had always been, and the world had to reckon with a nation that had never bowed, never broken, never surrendered an inch of its identity to the colonizers who had carved up the rest of the continent. And at the heart of it all, watching the sunset over a city that had been rebuilt from the rubble of Namor's flood, stood a man who had lost everything and found something greater in the losing. T'Challa, son of T'Chaka, king of Wakanda, Black Panther, still fighting, still protecting, still becoming. The story was not over. The story would never be over, because that was the nature of legacy. It did not end when the king died, did not conclude when the credits rolled. It continued through children and students and the millions of lives touched by a single individual's choice to stand between the darkness and those who could not fight it themselves. The panther hunted still, and the world was safer for it.